Welcome to Grid Talk. My name is Ruby Price, and today we're here to review the 2025 Formula One Grand Prix that took place in Australia this morning. Joining me today, we've got Louis Edwards
Hello.
and Owain Medford. It's so early, I almost forgot your name.
I know I'm just Louis again. That's remember that's the joke.
Oh yeah, that's the joke. We're bringing that back again for 2025 because we're recycling old material once again. No, we're not. Obviously, the season started again. But before we get into the episode, we must thank our sponsor for this episode, Bet Online. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, Bet Online is your ultimate game day companion. With the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC, BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat-trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. And where we have started here today, Louis, of course, F1 is back. We've had the first race of the season, obviously the first race since Abu Dhabi 2024. How do you feel? Like F1's back. How is it good?
Well, of course it's good. Yeah, incredibly happy that Formula One is back, and it was a great way to start. The first season, the first race of the season is always it's so much tension, there's so much uncertainty. We don't really know what's going to happen, and we're all like, what we've seen from testing, is it really going to come through? And it gives us a really great picture for the rest of the season. And this race didn't disappoint at all. It was fantastic, and a real great way to start the season. And we should just start in Australia. I think it's a good message.
Yeah, I was just about to follow on from that as well, particularly Owain. Obviously, we've not had Australia as the season opener now for about 5 years. I think it was obviously COVID-19 preventing it from being the opening race of the 2020 season. But with Ramadan taking place, of course, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia moved in the calendar to a little bit later, but Australia, it's a classic F1 opener, and I think this sort of like unpredictability, the randomness element, is that have we seen today why Australia is potentially one of the greatest like season openers that we've potentially ever had?
I mean, you were talking about recycling old material, and once again, it was chaos in Australia, although for slightly different reasons as to the last time we did. But I think it's the nature of the circuit that causes that every time. So, some people, if you're more of a purist, maybe don't want to see that. And obviously, we don't want to see cars crash. But I think it is one of those things. Is it's deceptively tricky. It's a nice smooth street circuit, and it's more conventional as a circuit than quite a lot of others. But I think the mix of sort of the fact that it's a slightly different tarmac and the walls being obviously so close, um, still give it that element of treacherousness, sort of, and I think the drivers found a lot of that. Found that an issue a lot today. I mean, we saw numerous accidents, and people just dropping it, even from sort of the even the more established drivers. And it's really easy to make those mistakes in the kind of conditions. But I think also the track layout makes it so much more. Um, it makes it so much more high stakes as well. In that you probably are going to end up in a barrier or at least beached on the grass if it is rainy and yeah, if it is rainy and you do make a mistake like that, obviously the weather played its part, but I think that's what I don't know. There's something about Australia; it just feels good, and it usually produces an exciting race. It's not necessarily indicative of the season to go on, um, but still, obviously, interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as you say, generally produces an exciting race that may not necessarily be representative of the remaining season. But what it does is it gives F1 that start of the season with a bang. And I feel like obviously, the last few seasons we've had pre-season testing in Bahrain, followed by a first race of the season in Bahrain. The teams have already run so many different simulations of the race on the track already by the time you even get to FP1 that they know exactly what's going to happen, because it's all in the data. Whereas, of course, Australia, it just presents that little bit of a curveball. And then, F1 starts with a bang. And I feel like that's really what's happened today. And Louis, leading on from that, for the first time since Spain 2022, Max Verstappen is not leading the Drivers' Championship. Lando Norris, of course, coming home today in P1 ahead of Max Verstappen and George Russell on the podium. But for a long time, it didn't necessarily look like George Russell would be appearing on the podium. Is the championship battle, this season between Lando and Max? Is it between Lando and his teammate Oscar? Or is it potentially all three of them at once?
I think the one thing that is like, as I mentioned earlier, usually we get a good clear picture from the opening round of where the season's going. Unfortunately, when you kind of had these like bit of crazy races with a lot going on, that actually is really hard. I mean, we can kind of know that the McLarens are going to be fast. We kind of know that. We knew that from qualifying. We know that Max is going to drag that Red Bull around every circuit. We just know that because of who Max is and the kind of driver he is. But it's kind of the rest of the field where we don't really have a good point of reference. We don't really know how quick the Mercedes are. Like George Russell got a podium today, but for most of that race, he was absolutely nowhere. It was the front three out in the distance, George way behind in fourth, and circumstances allowed him to get that podium. And then Ferrari, we don't know where they are because it was just Ferrari decision after Ferrari decision that completely cost them any meaningful points. And we don't know whether in different circuits or different races they're going to be competitive. But as for as for Lando Norris, as for winning the race, it's a great start to the season. It's if we think of the last couple of years with McLaren, usually incredibly poor starts. McLaren at the end of 2023 were very quick and they were starting to really push, and then started 2024 in the worst possible way. This year they've had a really good, really positive start, and that's going to allow them to push on, hopefully, more into the rest of the season and be a little bit more dominant and not allow Red Bull or Max to get close. But we know that Max is still going to be there.
Yeah, definitely. Like, a lot really like still to play for. It's the first race of a very long season. But Owain, at one point, as Louis touched on, the front three were so far out, ahead of everyone else. Even in fairness, by the end of the race, Max Verstappen and Lando Norris 8 seconds ahead of George Russell in the distant P3. But at one point, it looked like the McLarens were so comfortable. They'd built up, I think, a 16, 17 second gap ahead of Max Verstappen. If circumstances were a little bit different, do you think McLaren really would have like finished this race, maybe even 30 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen by the end of it?
Well, let's assume that nothing goes wrong. We don't get any sort of inclement weather coming in, and on the dry tires, it looked like the Verstappens, the McLarens were, they were just in a world of their own, really. I mean, once Max had burned through his tires, on the Inters, or seemingly had burned through his tires, maybe the McLaren is set up a little bit softer and doesn't wear on them as much. As you say, they were just pulling away, and it didn't seem like they were going to, it seemed like the inter-team battle was more of an issue. And once we had the hard tyres on for the McLarens and obviously the mediums for Max, I think, as long as they both kept it on the tram lines, I kind of think, Max would have obviously initially, taken the fight to them. But following on from that, I think again, like unless there was a warm-up issue for the McLarens and something, the mediums just sort of suited the Red Bull and made it faster on the day. I really didn't think anything else was going to stop them. It's kind of a slightly ominous performance. Obviously, we had that ominous lap time. Sorry for Max in qualifying, but the McLarens really did just seem to have the measure of everybody. It honestly seemed, it just seemed like that kind of performance where you're just like, oh, is this going to be the season? I don't think it will be, and I hope it's not. I hope it changes from track to track, but I think McLaren were unlucky to come away with just the win. I think they could have got an awful lot more there.
Yeah, I think at one point as well, they really could have been coming away from this particular race weekend with maximum amount of points available. And at one point, Louis, it looked like they were specifically trying to capitalize on that. A bit of team orders going on, Oscar not necessarily being allowed to pass Lando. Given the context at the time, do you think this was the right decision that they were making? Or do you think it potentially even led to, the situation of the drivers not being where they should be by the end of the race?
It's a tough one. It's the first race of the season, so naturally a lot of people are not going to be very happy with it, and I think it's true people weren't. But I think you have to look at it objectively that even though the gap was big, it was like something around 16 seconds. There was a time where the dry tires were about to come in, as we saw when the safety car came out, like maybe a few laps later. That I think McLaren was just looking for a nice gap to pit both of their drivers on probably quite quickly, and obviously to come out ahead of Max, just in case there was a safety car. If Max had decided to maybe stick it out a bit longer, the last thing they want to do is forfeit track position. Because there was always, they were always trying to keep in the back of their mind that this second batch of rain was going to come. So I think it did make sense to hold position at that time, but eventually they did let it go. They did say they were free to race after they did swap over onto the dry tires, and then circumstances happened, and Oscar was never given that chance. But in fairness to Oscar, he did look incredibly fast during that time. He definitely did look as though that he could have had a chance at winning. But I think McLaren were just trying to be cautious. We think of how many times they threw it away last year because of weird just team decisions. I think they were maybe playing it a little overly cautious at the sake of maybe some racing at the front.
Yes, and Oscar Piastri clearly having pace as well, coming despite being off the track for a significant amount of time towards the end of the race, coming back in to finish P9 with a last lap, I believe, move on Lewis Hamilton, in a phenomenal, display of skill and also trust in the other driver that they're not just going to take you out, especially given the track conditions at the time. But Owain, let's talk about the rain then, of course, and the rain really did trip up a lot of drivers, not just, seasoned veterans of over, many, many seasons worth of races, but the rookies in particular, Isaac Hadjar, that heartbreaking moment, DNSing ultimately on the formation lap, Jack Doohan being out on lap 1, Bortoleto being out, Liam Lawson being out, Oliver Behrman, he's finished at the back, but of course there were a few other sort of issues generally just with Haas there. But of course Kimi Antonelli, was flying at one point, did go off the track in a move very similar to George Russell, but, how do you think the rookies just needed a little bit more experience for the rain particularly, or, is this just a case of Australia, weird track conditions and, untested rookies, well, not necessarily untested, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, the fact, I'll put it this way: all of these drivers have a fairly good feel in the wet. But there's some there who are going to be better than others. But I think one of the things that they were taken by surprise because you don't get experience of this in the lower formulas. And you wouldn't have done in any kind of preseason testing or any kind of private testing that the teams would have done with old cars, is that these hybrid power units do, as much as they have matured and they have sort of been more refined over the years, there's still the element of there's an awful lot of torque coming through at once. And if you're not prepared for it, if you're slightly out of position or you've got your wheels on a white line or anything like that, it is so easy, even in a high downforce car, for you to spin up the rear wheels. And at that point, we saw even Fernando Alonso doing something similar. It's very difficult to get out of those kind of spins. There's so much momentum to the cars as well. They're very difficult to save, and I think the rookies will learn from this. That you really do have to treat it's a massive skill to be able to drive these cars in the wet weather. They really are sort of on a knife edge. And when that power comes in, it's very easy to get carried into an accident. I don't think this is indicative of how they mean to go on. I mean, we saw Carlos Sainz, and Fernando Alonso do the same thing. So this is very clearly not isolated to the rookie drivers, but I think you can very clearly see by the number of drivers that did it, very clearly this was sort of canted towards the drivers with less experience, and that's I think why that happened. But we saw Max Verstappen snatch a break. It's very easy for him to do a similar thing and end up down an escape road. That's just a sort of kind of thing that's bound to happen in wet conditions. I mean, that's how hard these guys are pushing, and inevitably that's going to lead to some mistakes at the edge cases.
Yeah, definitely pushing really hard. Obviously wanting to make an impression on their debut as well. But Louis Antonelli, I mentioned, was flying at one point, really showing a lot of skill, and of course the sort of areas where he was strongest, particularly in F2. There was a lot of talk of him, after a safety car period, just taking off and like sort of, losing the pack when it came to those sort of mixed conditions. Like, was this kind of Antonelli, showing what he's sort of capable of on the first race of the season, do you think?
It was very clean, very like mature drive from Kimi Antonelli today. Qualifying was definitely disappointing yesterday, being eliminated in Q1. He knew he had a big gap to make up and really gain some positions today. And he just sort of like bided his time. He was just slowly making his way up, making the opportunities, count every time that they came up. And he did a really good job, but he came all the way back to P6. I mean, P5, was it P5 on the road or P4 on the road? Either way, got the penalty in the end, which is a shame. But a huge recovery, and I think a race that he'll definitely be proud of, especially when we, as Owain mentioned, the other rookies kind of had a little bit of a tougher time. So yeah, I think he was very solid, and I think it is what you said. Like it's a good sign of what's to come from Antonelli, and if he can qualify a bit higher, maybe next time he can be right in there with the rest of the pack and be able to gain even more positions. But I was incredibly impressed by Kimi Antonelli today, and I think just generally Mercedes in general, they both, him and Russell, drove a very nice, solid race. No mistakes, no like showy no flashy stuff. It was all good. However, saying that, every time we did see Antonelli during the race, he was usually like wrestling the car back to being in a straight line. He was really going for it, which is good to see.
Yeah, really good to see. And as we saw in this race, a race where, making those kind of, moves can have disastrous consequences in the race context. But, you know, certainly enjoyed seeing a lot of Antonelli's moves, particularly the ones to in the third sector when making some overtakes on damp tr parts of the track. Very much enjoyed that. But if you're enjoying this podcast, we'd love it if you could take 5 to leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you're watching the YouTube live stream, get in the live chat, leave us some comments for the post show, and make sure that you hit the like button, and I will stop being the cringe YouTuber at this point. But if you're one of the 77% of people who aren't yet subscribed to the channel, please consider helping us out with a subscribe. And then, let's move on to the second half. We're going to take a look at drivers at new teams. And Owain, I think the most surprising result I think I could say for this particular race at the very least, other than Lance Stroll being in P6, which, will be mentioned once and we'll never talk about again. But Hulkenberg in P7 for Sauber, having started P17, Martin Brundle gave him some advice on the grid of go fast and don't crash. And he's done just that in a Sauber. Like, how much should we be applauding Nico Hulkenberg today?
I mean, you know what? I think Nico Hulkenberg gets a bad rap a lot of the time, bearing in mind that the guy is a seasoned, is a seasoned professional. He's been doing this an awful long time at this point, getting on for 16 years. And, obviously he hasn't reached the heights of a podium or a win or even a podium at any point during that career, which is unfortunate, given, the skill that he very clearly has. I think this was a race of survival, really. The rain is the great leveler, and because of that, obviously a slightly less, a quite bad Sauber car. I thought I'd just change that about to get that to where it actually is in terms of performance. It's not a great car, but the fact is that loads of people were falling off in front of him, and to keep it on the island, to make sure you don't make the mistakes, to make the strategy calls at the right time, which is what caught out Ferrari. I think Lewis Hamilton should maybe have, the moment he saw Tsunoda go off in front of him, should have dived in the pits, because it was very clearly soaking wet. Like, he says he was going off the information that he had from the team, and it was a lot wetter than that, which is fair enough. But very clearly, Sauber have that together. They have that part of the team, at least for this weekend, sorted, and it's benefited them hugely. That's why I voted him for my driver of the day. I think genuinely he had an absolutely brilliant performance, and that has brought Sauber some well-needed points that I think is going to serve them in very good stead in the midfield battle this season. I know it's early to be talking about that, but this is when you can steal a march, and we saw it with Red Bull last year. But for the opposite end of the championship, or Max Verstappen more specifically, sorry. But the early points you get, it's so much harder to make those points up mid-season. But the early points you get, particularly in a race like this, become gold dust later on. And these could be 6 super valuable points when it comes for prize money next year. And I think it's all down to Nico Hulkenberg's ability to manage that car for 57 laps in tricky conditions.
Absolutely. And it wasn't like he inherited P7 because of loads of collisions. And of course, there were a lot of collisions, but, he was in P7 from pretty much, the start of the race almost. Obviously made a good start, and then capitalized on that, and then managed to stay in that position. And, gradually, as more cars were having their issues, it was a race of attrition. You've got to be in it to, win it. And yeah, as you say, some very much needed points for Sauber at the point where a lot of their rivals aren't scoring. And yeah, it could pay off massively towards the end of the season. Louis, looking at some of the other drivers then who've gone to, new teams, aside from the rookies who we've obviously kind of touched on a little bit, Lewis Hamilton has gone to Ferrari, started P8 and he's finished P10. Esteban Ocon has gone to Haas. He started towards the back. If in fact, was the final driver on the grid because, of course, Lawson and Behrman started in the pit lane. He's finished P13 for the Haas. Obviously, there's a lot of strategy that could be talked about for Haas going on there. And Carlos Sainz, of course, gone to Williams, and he's DNF. How do you think these new drivers are fared at their teams in particular?
Carlos Sainz was, I think, is a quick one. It was just an unfortunate error. I think he was having a great weekend. The whole weekend with Williams was really good, and unfortunately, he just got a bit of a kick. And as Owain sort of mentioned earlier, once these cars go round, they go round. They have so much weight, so much momentum. It's hard to, especially at low speed, to try and really catch that and like keep it in a straight line. Um, so it was just unfortunate for Sainz. You know, if we touch on Haas quickly, I mean, I really don't understand what Haas were trying to do. I mean, they were slow, and I understand that they were really trying to go for something and stay out on those on those dry tires as long as possible. Oh no, they were trying to stay out on the inters for as long as possible, hoping that the safety car would kind of bridge that gap between the last lot of rain until the new lot of rain. So they were really gambling. They would just get let through and then they pit. It's like, oh, for God's sake, they were really just playing around, and then they all just got like caught up in the safety cars, and it was just a mess from Haas. This weekend is just something to completely write off. I saw someone post earlier like the best thing about this weekend for Haas is that it's over. It was really bad. And then as for Lewis Hamilton, I think all you can say is welcome to Ferrari. Welcome to the incompetent team that somehow just have no idea what the hell they're doing, even though they've been in this sport so many years. They have some of the top people in the sport in their organization. Yet their decision not to switch from the hard tires onto the Inters while everyone else was clearly struggling, the McLarens were flying. They could have easily finished third and fourth today, without a doubt. After Piastri's spin, after all the chaos, those couple of laps, all they had to do was bring it in. And I think Lewis was getting very agitated on the radio. He told his engineer basically in the nicest possible way to shut up after 15 laps. It was, he clearly had enough. And then he was incredibly disappointed. I've seen some of the quotes from that he said after the race, saying the car is incredible to drive. It was a lot harder than he thought it was going to be, which is really not a great sign. For Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari career thus far. But who knows? Who knows? Things might get better. It's what happens when you redesign a car for a new season, even though you had quite a strong car last year, and unfortunately things have not gone as expected. But who knows? Maybe things will turn around for the better, but it's really unfortunate for Lewis today. He possibly had one of the most Ferrari debuts you could possibly ask for.
Yeah, I certainly think so too. And you've, touched quite nicely on the next sort of like talking point that I was going to bring up of course, Ferrari drivers versus their Ferrari engineers. We heard so many different like levels of bickering between the driver and the engineer. Owain, like, Charles Leclerc asking if there was a leak and the engineer just kind of being like, what leak? And then something about water and leaked bottles. It was raining at the same time, so I'm not sure as to whether Charles just, wasn't aware of that, or maybe he thought it was some of George Russell's sweat from 2023 or 2024. I can't even remember when that niche reference was. But
2023.
thank you, Louis. But Ferrari drivers versus Ferrari engineers. We've seen it before, and we've seen it again now today. Do Ferrari just have almost a bit of an issue where, like, their drivers have lost so much faith in their engineers that, when they're being coached, it's just kind of like, please just leave me alone.
No, I don't think it's that, because otherwise you'd sort of like, I don't know, from the outside looking in, you'd expect that maybe from like that would hold water as a theory, I think, if it was Charles Leclerc who was the only one saying it. But it was both him and Hamilton, so it very clearly seems to be more sort of a. You know what? To be honest with you, I think it was more of a kind of just owing to the conditions. I mean, I'll put it this way: the straights become corners at times. When it's raining like that and it's tricky conditions and there's kinks all over this track that normally you wouldn't think twice about in the dry. But the wet, you have to be watching. I mean, we saw that Hadjar, spun up his rear wheels on admittedly cold tires. Um, with not a lot of rain, and there was more rain coming down. And the Albert Park circuit is littered with white lines. They painted some of the black, obviously, but again, but ultimately, it is littered with white lines, and any one of those becomes, it just becomes an ice rink. And once, as we said earlier, once it goes, it starts. Once it starts to go, it's kind of, it's almost guaranteed to end up in a barrier if you're unless you're incredibly lucky. So I think it was more that I think Ferrari, there's an element of Lewis learning, but I think for the most part, you can probably attribute it pretty confidently to the fact that, there's a time and a place for the talking about this stuff, but it has to be like in very short instances, right at, sort of in the last sort of half of a straight. Any other time, and it's incredibly distracting when you're trying to keep a handle on these conditions that are evolving lap to lap or corner to corner, and trying to work out how to just navigate your way through it and keep it on the island. And I think that was it for the most part. I don't think it's a lack of faith. I think it's just maybe a bit too much being said at the wrong times. Which we saw all up and down the grid. I think we had the same with McLaren. I think sometimes I felt it was a bit too conversational in the kind of conditions where you just need information or yes or no answers.
Yeah, that was something I noticed a lot as well about the McLaren radio conversations. They seem to go on for like multiple steps of a conversation. And as you say, in those conditions, you just want, tire condition, fuel condition still looking good and all of that stuff. You don't want, you know, four score and 7 years ago whilst you're going through a very tight, twisty section where if you go, half a millimeter to the side, you're in much wetter conditions. We could see in the first sector or towards the end of the first sector that the cars were on a specific rail track almost of, one specific dry track area. And if you were a few millimeters wide, well, we saw Fernando Alonso, spinning around. We saw Oscar Piastri almost losing positions to Max Verstappen because of going slightly wide, maybe during a radio conversation with McLaren where they gave him too much information. But yes, a very good point, particularly about radio conversations. And we're going to move on now to our driver of the day. So Grid Talk officially gave it to Max Verstappen. Louis, I'm going to come to you. Do you agree with our driver of the day choice, or have you got someone else to put forward?
I agree with it because I voted for Max. I voted for Max. It may seem like a weird choice. I mean, he started P3, finished P2, but I think for me, there's a lot of context behind that. He was in a much inferior car, had a mega start. I mean, he was challenging Lando for the lead into turn one. He then was right on the back of Lando for a lot of the race when he was in P2. Only a slight issue dropped into P3. He then, kept it going, kept it competitive when all the the safety cars were happening, and he remained competitive. He took advantage of when Lando and Oscar had their little bit of a rally moment, and then kept it going on those hard tires or medium tires, I should say, until we got there. Well, until we went for the safety car again, and then right at the end, he really put the pressure on Lando. In a car that does not deserve to be anywhere near the front, doesn't deserve to be winning races. He showed up today and he was incredibly competitive. And on another day, he could have won this.
Yes, absolutely. I think there was always that potential and that threat, which again is another reason as to why McLaren were so, team ordery almost of, make sure we get this right because, we don't want to give away points to who is going to be, one of our main championship rivals in the first race of the season. Owain, do you agree with Louis? Do you agree with Grid Talk? Who was your driver of the day today?
Unfortunately, I've alluded to it earlier, and also given probably used up all my talking points here, but I gave it to Nico Hulkenberg instead. I thought he qualified in quite a lowly position, but he made it count when it mattered. In as I say, very tricky conditions, and as I said earlier, he got himself, a vital 6 points. I mean that we've seen that make a huge amount of difference come the end of the season. Obviously we don't know what the next 23 races hold, but one or two more of those, and it starts to become a kind of insurmountable amount of points that might, it might just put them sixth, it might just put them fifth if they're very, very lucky, and we have a couple more of those kind of races, or and they play their cards right tactically and just do the, keeping on the right tire at the right time, not throwing it in the barrier, making up for. Yeah, he's the reason you hire Nico Hulkenberg, is that you want a good, he's maybe not the fastest. I think Bortoletto is, definitely a star for the future, but Nico Hulkenberg is the rock that you build your championship on, for Sauber, and I really think he's made the difference today. That could, this sort of could be a long-lived, sort of advantage that he's put Sauber at, compared to all the other midfield teams on the grid.
Absolutely, definitely. And for me, I changed my driver of the day a few times during the race. At one point, it was going to be Bernd Mailander. There were a lot of laps behind the safety car, and he did a good job of keeping it on the track. At one point, I changed it to Kimi Antonelli because I thought he was doing quite well given, where he started and where it looked like he was going to finish. And then, of course, there was a penalty heading his way. And whilst obviously an unsafe release, is more of the team's fault, of course, drivers and teams win and lose together. But yeah, for me, I gave it to Lando Norris. I thought he did a good job of controlling the race. Of course, went off the track. But, given Lando's history with interchangeable conditions and, McLaren's history with, losing races that they should be winning, I thought, it would have been very easy for him to lose his head and lose the lead of the race, particularly in those last few moments when Max Verstappen was very much putting a lot of pressure on him, hunting him down, trying to get, the continuation of, the Max Verstappen dominance we've seen over the last few years. But, that's kind of where we're going to leave our show. So, Louis, is there anything you'd like to plug at this opportunity?
The only thing I would really like to plug is our social channels. So at Grid Talk UK, that is on all platforms, including YouTube. In fact, at Grid Talk UK. Yeah, so go give us a follow. Instagram, Blue Sky, YouTube, wherever you get your social media. I sound like I'm 80 years old there. But yeah, and then also, if you want to support the show, check out our Patreon and our Patreon exclusive podcast, behind the beyond the grid talk. That's it. Beyond the grid talk. Behind the grid talk. Beyond the grid talk. Yeah. So
Got there in the end, Louis. Owain, is there anything left for you to plug at this opportunity?
I'm slightly surprised that Louis has shied away from plugging Grill the Grid Talk. You know what? Like, he's remembered now. It's like, oh, there's that thing that I do where I make all of our hosts look a little silly, or maybe just me. I think it's just me. But yeah, obviously catch up on the rounds that we've completed thus far, 1 to 3. I look so clever in round 2. You have to see it. Like, you'll be amazed at how clever I look at it. But yeah, Grill the Grid talk. I don't know when the next episode is coming out. I assume it is in production. Otherwise, it's just going to end at round 3, and that's going to suck.
No, it'll be coming out in our little. We've got, because we have this weekend, and then of course next weekend in China, and then it will come out in that kind of break that we have after China to check out round 4 when it comes out.
Louis got it all planned out, but yes, absolutely. Please do go and check out Grill the Grid Talk. It's been a lot of fun to rewatch, a lot of fun to take part in, and it'll be a lot of fun for you to test your knowledge against us F1 experts in the biggest inverted commas that I could possibly put around that phrase. If you want to hear more from me, I'm on the Meta socials, Threads, and Instagram at Ruby Rose Price, and I'm on Blue Sky at rubes.bluesky, whatever they put on the end of it. But if you want to hear more from Grid Talk, we are available on YouTube, where our race review shows are recorded live, as well as Amazon Fire, Spotify, Apple Music, Verbal, and Pocket Casts. Just search Formula One Grid Talk for our back catalogue of shows with previews and reactions to the race results. Thank you to Jared Bradley and Holly Eagle for supporting us on Patreon. If you want to support the show further, as Louis plugged earlier, why not sign up to our Patreon for exclusive content? We've got our own Patreon exclusive Beyond the Grid Talk podcast, which is a lot of fun to do, I must say so myself. Also, make sure you subscribe so you're the first to know when each new episode is released, and we'll be back soon with plenty more F1 content, including a Chinese preview. Thank you very much for listening to the Grid Talk podcast presented by Bet Online, and goodbye. And as we swing into a brief post-show, first of all, I just want to come to both of you for this comment that we've had from Tomas, I want to say. Eat your words, Helmut Marko. This could be in reference to, I think this is in reference to one particular thing. But what do you think, Louis? Does Helmut Marko have to eat some of his own words?
I'd rather him eat a lot more than just his own words. Yeah, Helmut Marko is a character. He's a character. You can take that as you wish when I say character. Yeah, his sort of thing of, which drivers are A tier drivers, B tier drivers, C tier drivers. He's an absolute waffle machine, that man. He is, you know, you know, for someone who has brought some serious talent into this sport, there's no denying. Through the Red Bull Junior program is an incredibly well run program. It does bring a lot of talent through through the lower formulas and towards Formula One. But he has seriously he just can't seem to help himself and just open his mouth and say something stupid, and when he's talking about the likes of Bortoleto and Doohan and calling them B tier and C tier drivers, and it's just ridiculous. Bortoleto is a Formula 2 champion. He won the championship last year. Jack Doohan has been someone who's been floating around the F1 paddock for years now. He's someone who's been taken incredibly seriously. He's just unfortunately a part of what's called a junior program that's not always too keen on promoting young drivers. But yeah, it's all a bit stupid, and I wish I could say more, but I can't.
Yeah, maybe that's a topic for Beyond the Grid Talk where we can say a little bit more. But Owain, anything you want to add to this? Do you think Helmut Marko's got to eat his own words, or potentially more, as Louis alluded to?
I'll put it this way. Hadjar binned it off the start. Well, before the start. Lawson binned it. Well, one qualified 18th and then binned it in exactly the same way as Hadjar into the same piece of Armco. also by compare, I think there's sometimes where you might at least say that yeah, Helmut Marko is a Class C person on occasions.
Do you think they should put Checo in the RB?
So I think they should put Sonoda in the Red Bull. You know what? No, just put let's put Helmut Marko in one of the cars. Like, put your money where your mouth is.
I think he has an issue with judging distances, due to an injury that he sustained at one point. So that might make it a little bit different, a little bit difficult, on his own side of things. He might end up being an F grade driver, if given the opportunity to shine. Also want to come to a comment that we've had from George. Hi, George. It's, good to see you in the chat. Very grateful to have you here. So glad this race was worth getting up at 4 in the morning for, So for a start, you've just missed the cars, going off for their formation lap. But what is it with early starts and there being a red flag, a safety car, just something to delay, just something to delay the race start properly? As Louis, does the tiniest violin in the world from Japan.
You know what? You didn't have to move to Japan, Louis. You didn't have to move to Japan. You could have stayed on the side of the globe,
Well,
and
you can
and the,
complain
and
about
the,
things.
yeah, yeah, you could, yeah, the portion of the globe where this is annoying and out of the norm. You know what?
It was
I
worth
mean,
getting
yeah,
up
okay,
for.
Uh,
it's on me, but still, oh no. I am for the first time in a long time. I'm sat here doing a podcast, and it's still daylight outside.
Talking about it's still daylight outside here.
Yeah, but it's usually I'm recording at
Still,
like I mean, like most European races are like what 10, 11 p.m. here. Um, then we have the night races in the Middle East, like Bahrain is not a fun one. Qatar is not a fun one. Any of the South American races are absolutely horrible. Apart from then we get Vegas, which is like weirdly just nice because
because
it's like
Vegas isn't a
midnight.
time for for actual American fans.
Yeah. Um,
No, they're
but
moving it. But they gradually bring it into the hot weather.
yeah, it's I can't speak. I went out, went shopping this morning, had lunch, at an Italian chain place here in Japan, which is it's really cheap, but it's really bad. Um, ran for my train because I was late, got home and sat and watched the Grand Prix like a normal day.
Can't wait for the European races then, can you, Louis? But yeah, Owain, did you think this race was a good one worth waking up early for?
Yeah, I was. I enjoyed it. I mean, to be fair, I enjoy every race, but I think it was definitely interesting, and it's if you're trying to get people into F1, I think you do have to have an interesting first race, just because otherwise people are going to be like, sort of, if just from an attracting new fans point of view, if you get an exciting race, I think it helps. So I think it does help to be at Albert Park in a way, because we do normally get this kind of race, and it does feel like it makes it worth it to have got up at 4 a.m. Or before in that case. In any case, I mean, I wasn't up as early as some of you, but. I left enough time to get the TV on and make a drink, before watching, the carnage, sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it definitely feels better to have it be a good race. Can you imagine if it was at? I'm trying to think of a boring racetrack now. Can you imagine if in Monaco was at this time, or
Yeah, I mean,
Sochi when we had that on the calendar?
yeah, imagine that. But yeah, I did allude to, of course, Australia having, just F1 needing a good opening race of the season to like properly spark that, invigoration amongst the fans. Like it's the first opportunity for a lot of people to make their minds up about whether, they want to, invest as much time in the rest of the season. And in fairness, I was writing off 2024 by the time we got to like the third or fourth race of the season. And what a season we ended up having. Granted the title, the driver's title, I'll get there in the end, was never really like on the cards for changing unless something seriously drastic happened. But at the same time, we had what was clearly one of the more invigorating and exciting seasons in 2024. But on that note, thank you very much to everyone that stuck around. It's been really good to see some activity in the chat, particularly towards the post show. But yes, we will be back for our Chinese preview on Wednesday. It's been very fun to see Formula One back on track once again. And on that note, thank you very much for watching, and we will see you later.